So in this video, I'm going to take a look at the Mac Mini expansion device from Minisopuru, and it's the iExpandMate M4 Mac Mini dock. I use a Mac Mini M4 for my recording and my video editing workflows, and I took a look at this because it's a fairly simple product, but it solves some very specific needs that I have with my Mac. So Minisopuru sent this for me for review, but I am not being paid for this. They have no influence over what I say, and this is my own personal take in the product. So in short, it's a USB hub. It provides some additional connectivity such as things like SD cards, and most notably you can install some NVMe in this device to expand your Mac storage, and that's without paying that Apple tax. There's a couple of other things to point out also, and I'll also be doing a full performance and compatibility test with a range of SSDs inside the hub. So before we start, let's take a look at what you get, and we can then talk about why this is a good addition to my Mac Mini setup. And we can dig into what it's good at and what it isn't so good at, and also we can see how this device might fit your needs. So in the box you get the USB stand itself, as well as a short USB 3.2 Gen 2 cable, and that's suitable to connect the two together, and then it sits underneath the Mac. It also comes with some fittings to fit an NVMe card, and you can use a 2230, 2242, 2260 or 2280 size NVMe, but those not too familiar with these sizes, it's a pretty standard set of sizes. And you get a small screwdriver to open the panel and fit the drive. And I'm going to be personally fitting, to start with at least, a crucial 1TB P3 drive, and then we're going to do some testing with some others as well to see if we find any compatibility issues and also see what this really tells us about performance. Now the device supports up to 4TB drives, but it also comes with a heat pad for your SSD, and because the case is an all metal aluminium construction, the whole unit basically acts as a heatsink for the SSD. But personally, as we'll come to, I'd recommend a Gen 3 card just to reduce the heat generated, and that's given the bandwidth we're available, which we're going to come on to a bit later. Now the unit itself is connected, as I said, over this USB 3.2 Gen 2 x 1 connection, and that's 10 gigabits per second. Looking at the other ports here, we can see that there's 3 other USB 2 ports, which provide each a maximum of 480 megabytes per second. Now, if you question why these are not 3.2 ports, I think there are multiple reasons, even putting aside the cost. So first of all, this is not a Thunderbolt dock, it is a USB 3.2 dock. So all of the ports and the NVMe, they're all going to be sharing that 10 gigabits per second bandwidth. Now you could argue a single USB 3.2 port might have been useful, but again, it looks like they tested this and settled on USB 2 to reduce the impact to Wi-Fi. Secondly, my own personal need of this device was not to have USB 3.2 ports. The Mac Mini has a number of USB 3.2 and Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports, Thunderbolt 5 if you have a Pro unit, and I still have a number of USB-A requirements like the old USB ports. And one of the key reasons for this dock is for the legacy support. So my primary use case, personally at least, is USB-A connectivity for low bandwidth devices like flash drives and a keyboard. So you get 2 USB 2.0 type A ports at the front, and you get the one at the back, and that suits me fine. So those wanting to plug in type C devices, however, you're going to need to connect those to the Mac itself. There are no type C ports on the dock. Next, the device also has an SD and a micro SD card slot. I don't use these a great deal personally, occasionally maybe, but for creators they're definitely handy to have access to, and it's a nice piece of added functionality to have available because often you may not have any way to connect these up to the Mac. And these are rated to UHS 1 or Ultra High Speed 1, which Minisopuru state is 104 megabytes per second. I'm going to be testing this myself later to see what we really get. Around the back, there's a USB-C slot, but this is just for connectivity back to the Mac itself. There's also an HDMI, which for me personally is actually really useful because I run 2 monitors on my Mac. So this is a way to allow me to connect one natively to the Mac and to have my second monitor plugged in to the hub. And finally, there's also an audio jack, which, given that there's one on the front of the Mac Mini, I personally probably am not going to use. But if you prefer to have that cable tucked around the back, then it's there and you can use it. So in summary, the hub allows for extra NVMe drive to be added, but also for a load of other lower bandwidth peripherals to be connected without having to consume USB-C ports on the Mac itself, which you can then use for higher bandwidth use cases. So you also notice there's a cutout notch on the device, and the purpose is probably obvious if you own a Mac Mini, but this does allow you to get to the power button on the Mac Mini, which for some mysterious reason is in a really awkward place. Now I'm not going to litigate the reasoning here behind that, but the notch here lets you get to this more easily, and this in itself is also quite a nice little benefit. And the top of the device also has this inset ring with a kind of rubberized contact patch, and that helps to keep the Mac in place, stop it sliding around, and it allows the Mac to sit neatly and securely on top of the device. Okay, let's get it plugged in by connecting the USB 3.2 cable to the back of the Mac. So there's basically nothing to this, and once connected, any monitor connected to the HDMI appears, the NVMe or SD cards will also appear in disk utility, and it really couldn't be more simple. So as I mentioned, it seems that the USB 2 is an intentional design choice to prevent interference with the Mac Mini Wireless, which some hubs have caused problems with. There is an Intel white paper, which I'm going to link below. Actually, it's quite interesting if you want to read it. But basically, it talks about how USB 3 interferes with 2.5 GHz band devices like wireless. The Mac itself actually uses wireless 6E, which uses the 2.4 GHz band, but it also uses 5 and 6 GHz. But it seems that USB 3 can cause interference in these upper ranges also, and it has been a problem. So I haven't tested the wireless performance today because I use 10 gigabit wired at home. But what I will be testing is the performance of the storage devices connected to the hub, because having the additional NVMe is really handy given the lack of native upgradability in the Mac Mini storage. As I've covered in some previous videos, I don't use the internal Mac storage for much as it's unreasonably expensive to upgrade. So I run everything except the base OS on an external Thunderbolt 4 SSD. It's faster, it's cheaper, and it's worked flawlessly for me. I will link the video below where I did all the performance testing for this and configured it if you're interested. Okay, so the hub here won't provide the performance for mounting your main drive as it's USB 3.2 only, but it does provide a far cheaper and very convenient way to install an SSD for larger storage. And honestly, USB 3.2 Gen 2 is still pretty good. It offers 10 gigabits per second, which is around 1250 megabytes per second access to the drive. However, as I said, I suspect the NVMe slot is actually only Gen 3 and probably only has a single lane. And this is just from previous experience with other USB connected NVMe devices. The truth is, there simply is nearly no benefit to running all 4 possible lanes on the NVMe interface, and there's also no real benefit to running in PCI Gen 4. And the reason is that each Gen 3 lane can provide just shy of 1000 megabytes per second, and although this isn't quite enough to saturate a USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 interface, it's actually really close. So let's performance test the crucial P3 1TB Gen 3 SSD and see what we find. Now the 1TB version of this is currently $60 before tax in the US, it's about £64 on Amazon UK, and it's €75 on Amazon Germany store, but you know, the prices fluctuate and you do seem to be able to pick up deals from time to time, so you can keep an eye out for those. Now if we look at the right performance, indeed, we see that it does max out at 1000 megabytes per second for the first 15% of the drive, which is about 150 gigabytes. And it then drops to about 250 megabytes before recovering back to 1000 megabytes at around 40%, and largely speaking maintaining that kind of bandwidth for the rest of the write test. Now, what is going on here is actually nothing to do with the Minisopuru hub. The crucial P3 is a QLC NAND SSD, and it has a dynamic SLC cache only. I'm not going to go into all the detail here as I'm going to go deeper into SSD performance in a coming video, but the short version is that the crucial P3 is not a particularly fast SSD. And its caching and NAND setup is what is creating this performance profile. But writing the entire drive in one hit is not going to be a common use case, and the most important takeaway is that the interface to the SSD is indeed around 1000 megabytes per second. And we can also see that even an entry-level Gen 3 SSD, it gives good performance for the majority of use cases. And if we quickly look at the read performance, we can see also here that actually it's pegged at 740 megabytes per second all the way, but it reads that speed for the entire size of the drive. Okay, so next we're going to look at the crucial P3 Plus. Now this drive is basically the same drive as we just looked at, but it does come with a Gen 4 interface. And I'm testing this really just to confirm if the hub does have a Gen 3 slot as I expect. This card is a little bit more expensive than the P3, but it's only by $2 in the US at $62, by £1 in the UK at £65, and it's actually exactly the same price at Amazon DE at €75 than the base P3. And if we compare this to the P3, again, the performance is almost identical here with the same 1000 megabytes per second and the same behavior of the SSD based on its cache and NAND configuration, which looks to be exactly the same as the P3. The zigzagging performance in the final 150 gigabytes on both these drives looks to be the folding process, and this is where the drive converts its SLC cache into QLC storage as the drive nears capacity. And even this doesn't really significantly impact performance due to that 1000 megabytes per second limitation into the M.2 slot, and of course of the USB interface itself. So what this tells us is that going from a Gen 3 NVMe to a Gen 4 doesn't really make any difference here, and you just don't need to spend those extra dollars, even if it's just 2. But read performance is also exactly the same as we saw on the P3. So next, let's test a more budget NVMe, and I have here an Acer FA100. Despite this thing being a Gen 3 TLC NAND stick, it's actually slower than the others, coming from a 28nm process and having a smaller SLC cache. It does have better endurance, however, being TLC, based at 600 terabytes written compared to the 220 for the previous cards, but I don't think the endurance of the drive is a major concern given the performance profile. If you are pushing a drive constantly hard, you would probably be using a Thunderbolt and not a USB dock. And this card actually can't keep up even with the single Gen 3 lane, keeping the 1000 megabytes per second up only until around 8% capacity before dropping to 600 megabytes per second and then eventually down to 200 when it starts folding. This isn't obviously a high performance use case, so maybe this is okay. Unfortunately, I couldn't get smart stats through the hub, so I wasn't able to measure the onboard temps, but this card certainly seems to run hotter. None of the cards today showed any obvious signs of thermal throttling. Read performance, however, is exactly the same as the other two. So let's see what happens when we try something a bit more high end, and is it worth spending more on an SSD to put into this device? So here we look at two Gen 4 NVMe cards, and these are higher end cards, each rated in the 7000 megabytes per second range, way above the capabilities of the hub. This is the Crucial T500 2TB and the Lexar NM790 2TB, and these are both TLC NAND cards, with the Crucial coming with DRAM cache and a large 720GB SLC cache, and the Lexar using a host memory buffer instead of DRAM and having a reported 280GB SLC cache, and this is according to the TechPowerUp SSD database. And we can see that though we do have better performance for writes, it is marginal. There is a less drop off during the full drive sequential write test, but there isn't any serious improvement. That said, price difference per terabyte may not be huge at times, so a better SSD with higher endurance might be worth it, especially if you may use the card for something else later, but the truth is you won't likely get any significant difference in the experience between these cards. Read performance, again, is actually marginally better at around 770 megabytes per second as opposed to 740 megabytes per second previously, but it isn't significant either. One last thing, let's take a look at that SD card slot, and in the specs Minisopuru claim that this is a UHS 1 slot and they claim a performance of 104 megabytes per second. So I tested with a Lexar Professional 256GB Silver Plus card, which I'll also link below. Like all these tests, it's a full read and write averaged over 5 identical tests with a 15-minute delay between each test. This SD card is rated to 205 megabytes per second read and 150 megabytes write, and the results are interesting with a sustained write performance across the entire card at 153 to 157 megabytes per second and sustained read at 167 to 168 megabytes per second. Now, this may not matter to you, but my testing shows at least that the performance here on my unit at least exceeds the claimed performance from Minisopuru. So before any conclusions, do please hit the thumbs up on the video if you liked it. It helps the algorithm share my content with others, and if you are interested in storage reviews, technical deep dives and performance tests on storage and hardware, then please also do consider a sub to get some of this into your feed. I'll also link below the hardware tested here, including the hub and the various SSDs. Those affiliate links there do give me a very small commission to the channel without any cost to you, and it helps towards funding the hardware that I test, so as always, thank you. Okay, so what do I think of the hub, and what SSD would I suggest to use in it? In short, I really like it, and it fits at least my own personal needs perfectly. It fulfills the need I have some additional USB-A ports that are missing on the Mac. It gives me another HDMI interface. It gives me SD slots if I need them, but for me it also gives me an additional slot to stick in an SSD to give me more bulk storage locally on the Mac for things like video files, backing up data, etc. It also looks nice, and it fits nicely with the Mac's aesthetics, and it gives easier access to the power button so I don't have to pick the map up to get to it, which does, to be honest, irritate me. It's available at the moment for $85 USD on the Amazon US site and around £100 or euros on this side of the pond, so I think it's a reasonable price for what it provides, and so far I'm really happy with it. And what SSD would I choose to pair this with? Well, I would probably just go with the Crucial P3 to be honest, or the P3 Plus if it happens to be the same price. You're going to get the most out of the performance available without really paying any kind of premium. If you do find you can get something like a T500 or an NM790 for a similar price point at the capacity you're buying, then these are great choices. You won't experience much difference, and the use case for this card doesn't really stress these cards from a performance or endurance standpoint, but they're good cards and you might want to repurpose them later. So as always, thank you for watching. Do the like and subscribe thing, I would really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next.